In this video, we're going to talk about some more details about defsc components and rendering in general. So we'll start off with the basics first. A lot of people like a more compact notation for their DOM because it gets rather noisy. So that's easy enough to get by just doing a little referring in your header there, and then just get rid of the prefixing. And now this is a lot more compact. And then when you use some other element, just pull that out. So let's go through here and just dress that up and see that doesn't really change our rendering any. The other thing we're going to do, make sure I got my compile running here. I do. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to our index.html, and I'm going to add a style sheet, and I'm going to add Semantic Uis Css to our page, just so we can see some CSS in action. And if you've not used Semantic UI before, there's a nice website, tells you about all the elements, drop downs, labels, dimmers, loaders, etc. And there's also some React wrappers that I've written for Fulcro that you can use with them. And I'm just pulling that in so we can show how you use an existing CSS library or your own CSS library with Fulcro DOM elements. So once you've referred those, there is an optional, on any given map here. So let's go to the name here, and we could give it an options map, just like you can in React. This would be the equivalent to the attributes on the tag. So I could, for example, say style color red, right? Something like you'd do in just a normal kind of HTML-ish sort of way. And of course that applies right to the DOM. Of course you might also want to, let's say we were trying to make this look more like an actual form. We'd probably put a label tag around that one. Go up here and add label. And then maybe this would be a form. So this is the next little notation that I wanted to show you is, and I can actually just pop over here and inspect in the browser and show you what outputs. So this is taken from the pattern that Hiccup uses on closure-based DOM elements. So I might say in Hiccup div.ui.form, right? So in Fulcro you'd call this div function / macro. This is actually both. The system figures out which to use based on the context to choose in. For example, if you use it as a function, it acts as a function. If you use it more like this, it'll act as a macro. So for example, if I were to map over div with some parameters, then I get multiple divs out of that. This is being treated as a function. Now the difference between a macro and a function is macros are evaluated at compile time, and because of this, Fulcro is able to get you essentially the exact JavaScript you'd hand generate, or JSX would generate for you in terms of performance under certain circumstances. So this keyword is just a shorthand for saying class name UI form, and in here now we should be able to say that this is a field, and Semantic UI should format that age section a little bit differently. And of course, if this was an input, we'd see it look even more. So we have this .ui, .form, however many classes you want to put on there. We have an optional options map, and then we have the children. You'll get the best performance out of this if you always include the options map. So you see I'm kind of dropping it for convenience in a lot of these places just to make things a little tighter. And when you drop the options map, the macro essentially can't necessarily tell if the next thing is a call to, right, without source analysis, which we're not going to program into the macro. It can't tell whether or not this function you're calling is supposed to be returning the props for the div, or is supposed to be returning a child for rendering. And remember, this is at compile time, so we're in a closure environment, a JVM. We're not even on the browser, so we can't really ask, is that thing that? Now, in terms of what that means in real performance, without the options map, it's about a third as fast as with the option map, but we're still talking, typically microseconds of performance differences. So, for your convenience and reading ease, you can get really good performance without bothering to worry about the options map. But if, for example, you had some extremely large UI and you were noticing some lag in a particular environment, that's a way you could very easily reduce the React overhead to a third of what it would be otherwise. Okay, so we've got our CSS shorthand in place. We can start making our things look a lot prettier on the screen now. Oops. Div. You definitely have to have the dots in there. It tells you those aren't classes. And then of course we could do things like put a UI segment around that, which will give it a really nice little border and doll it up. Okay, so enough on CSS and the speed of the macro functions. So the next thing we want to talk about, once you've got the idea that you can format these things and label them up with CSS classes very easily, let's talk a little bit more about these option maps. So the component options is for the most part an open extensible map. It's literally not not purely a syntactic convenience of defsc. Query, ident, and initial state have a special interpretation where the macro does try to give you some help. In one of the earlier videos we talked about how initial state really needs to be a function, but this shorthand gets rid of a lot of the boilerplate for you and gets you some more error checking, like for example it telling you you're trying to initialize something called person, but that's not in your query, right? So it's kind of obvious to it that you stuck some stuff in here that you didn't mean to stick some stuff. You can always put these in lambdas. Same thing with query. Query actually has to be a function due to dynamic query support. This get query could be called at runtime and actually return a different query at live runtime than was set up initially statically on the component. But for the most part, you don't need to do anything manually inside of this lambda, so the macro can deal with the fact that you're not giving that. Anything else you ever see in this component options map is literal. So I could put data 42 in here, and Fulcro's perfectly fine for me to do that. And I can go down here to my comment block and I can say comp component options on person, and I can see that that's actually there. And you can also see that query is a function, ident's a function, initial state turned into a function, render got added. Render is this body, right? So what you end up with is the component really is mostly represented by this component options map that gets things thrown in it, either by the user directly as data, or via these three special ones. And of course you can add React lifecycles here. So the React lifecycle methods, they're a little special in that they have a meaning to React, but they're not special in terms of defsc doing anything particularly, or syntactically at least, interesting. So one of the things that's always defined for you in Fulcro and not in React, raw React, is a should component update function. And this is a function that takes this, let's see now, should component update props and state. And this function returns true or false to say whether or not the props and state have changed in a way that would change how the component renders. The pre-supplied version of this in Fulcro should be perfect for your needs. It basically checks to see if the props, state, or children have changed for the component. And if they have, it says yes, and if they haven't, it says no. And so you kind of automatically get this nice pure component short-circuiting of the virtual DOM diffing if the data for some subtree of a component that's updating hasn't actually changed. So if you're coming from person and the person's name changed, but none of the cars did, then you'd like this UI car thing to short circuit for every single car. And that's in fact what will happen by default in Fulcro. Another component lifecycle method, very commonly used component did mount. And this is a function that will receive this. And this function is not in the context of the argument list up here. It was in Fulcro 2. It is no longer in Fulcro 3. This is just a pure lambda. That means if you need to see the props, you have to pull them off of the component instance. Here we can just so if we reload this, look at the console, we see the person mounted, and there's the props. I guess we could have made that a little more obvious by, if I could hit the right keys on my keyboard here. Okay, so that's how you supply React lifecycle methods. This is documented in the doc string of defsc, which is a rather long doc string talking about all the different things that you can throw in here that Fulcro understands. Oh, I misspoke. There are a couple more extras in here that at least have, well, I mean, libraries can extend this too. So there's all sorts of things you might at some point want to place in this component options map. But I did want you to understand that it is an open map. If you're writing a library that adds things to this map, then of course you probably want to namespace your keywords so you don't accidentally collide with other people's ideas about what to throw into this options map. Another React one that people often ask about, because this is useful for things that need to perform as fast as possible. This is a little questionable in my mind in most cases, but this is essentially the constructor placeholder for the React instance. So instead of being able to write a constructor on here, you write an init local state, and this does two things. It gives you this and props as arguments, and then anything you return here will go into the React component local state. If you don't know what React component local state is, go and read the React docs. This is not a Fulcro feature, other than init local state is a way of naming a function that should run at component construction time and initialize the component local state. And the component local state is essentially something you can access via get state. So if I, and this is not what's in the app database, so this is not part of props. So if I reload this, it'll construct, and now you see the state is starting out to this closure script map A2. So if you need to do something, at construction time, the thing I very commonly use init local state for is callback functions, because the should component update of children or of elements, etc. Very often you put some sort of function, some sort of lambda on an attribute of a DOM element, an on-click or a form submission sort of thing. And every time you generate a lambda, so if I said, my on-click is some function of the event ... every time this renders, this is a brand new function. So it's going to change in memory every time, which means this value changes, which means if it was a value being passed to a component, the component's props are changing every time, which circumvents should component updates optimizations. So what you can do is you can write a function that takes an event up here, does its thing, put it in component local state. This is a very good use for this this particular feature of React, and then you can ask for that out of the component local state. Fine. just put it on the label name. Oh, I think I have to reload because init local state only happens at init. So now you can see I can click on the name and I get my click events. And the value of onClick here won't be changing at every render because init local state only gets called when the component is first created. The on-screen instance is first created. So that's the most common use for init local state that I recommend. Fulcro 3 is really fast at pulling data from the database. We're going to talk about that in a later video. And so typically the overhead of keeping the stuff in the centralized state atom and going through the query system isn't big enough to justify trying to use component local state as an optimization, because it's nice to be able to track your state and history, etc., be able to view it and inspect, get all sorts of interesting, useful features by actually tracking most of your real state in the real app database. But for things like this where you have an event handler or whatever, component local state can be a great place to put it just to keep it out of your way. Okay, so that's the component options map. I did want to mention one more thing, and that's ident. So it's not uncommon for us to have components that don't have a server identity, but for which we do want an identity in our local app database. So let's say we had person list, and this is going to be maybe person list people, and let's say in this particular case, hyphen. In this particular case, we don't want multiple lists. There's just going to be one list in our application, and it's not going to have an ID. Obviously, using this key as the table name and the ID isn't the right thing to do. So there's a couple of different ways you can specify an ident in the component options map, and so this is pretty important point right here. One is you can specify the table and then the key of how to get the ID, right? So for example, up here in person, we could have written this as the table name is people, person ID, and here let me comment these two things out for the moment. Oh, I have a total typo, so that's not going to work. We can just dump that. If I reload this and look at my app database, I'll now see there's a people table with my person in it. Right? Now the reason we use the ID key as the table name has to do with path home and some conveniences we get out of that when we use it that way. But traditionally, years back in terms of Fulcro, we were less specific on what you should or shouldn't name your tables, and today we have a definitive recommendation based on experience in other libraries, and that's that it should just be the same thing, and that's why in Fulcro 3 we have this shorthand that lets you just say they're the same thing. The table name and the way to get the ID is one thing. When we get to a singleton component where there's only going to be one representation in the database, the ID part of the ident is constant, and so we don't actually want it computed at all. And so that's where we typically just make these for these nothing. So the ident will get the arguments this and props, and you can compute it here. So right, the person ID get the person ID from props would be the boilerplate way of doing the person ident up above. And in this case, we're just going to make a constant one. We're going to say there's going to be some components that have IDs, and we're just going to make this one person list. If you're not used to the : notation in Clojure yet, you should get used to it because this is really important. This basically just prefixes this keyword. This is exactly identical to me typing app.client/personList since I'm in the app.client namespace. So that's a way of giving a keyword a localized namespace so that you don't accidentally collide with other things. So I can say, all right, you know what, I'm just going to put my arbitrary components that are in my system that are singletons into one database table, component ID. I'm going to call that person list. And then, I'm going to add some initial state here where there's a person list, keep doing that, people, and I'm going to start that off with an empty set of people. Now if I turn this into a join, then it knows these people are coming from that person table. And remember the shorthand we talked about in an earlier video, where this is actually going to get the initial state from a person because it sees it's a join to person. So this will actually fill a person into this list here. We can walk on up here and complete this. So let's change this key to people, and then let's get the query of person list, and then let's not give any arguments. Oh, oops, our person does need an ID and name. So we could actually put more than one person in here. Forgot we gave that, right? We gave these parameters to the person initial state. So we can actually make more than one person there. And so here we could then say map over UI person, people. We can maybe do our H3 people, and then we've got something mismatched here, line 57. Yes, root people, we should probably give it that it does not need any parameters. And then this is no longer person, this is people, and this is now UI person list. And then if we reload that, hopefully we see two people now, each with their own segment. Of course with the same exact subdata, because we didn't do anything creative down there. Okay, so this is how you assign a singleton ident to a component. And so that's a very, very important thing to know how to do. And you can see down here now I've got a component ID table, and if I open that up, I see there's a app person list that has people, and then edges going from there. Now remember in the earlier videos we talked about when you merge things, adding edges in, and you see how now I've just done the same kind of refactoring that I was talking about. Sample used to be the thing that was pointing at person. I didn't have to touch anything about person or car to move them to a different place in the UI. I just put something in the middle, and the layer above it now had to point to the new thing I was sticking in, and the new thing had to point to the things below it. So I just inserted this thing right in the middle, set up my initial state to be correct, and it just kind of self-healed on reload of the application to the new graph that I needed for that UI. So kind of an important demonstration of multiple things we talked about earlier to kind of remind you what that looks like. Okay, so those are our ident forms. We've talked about the component options being extensible, that everything else is literal, and that it's probably a good idea if you add things to this options map. You know, my idea of stuff should be namespaced. And that way, if you're, at least if you're making a library and you're publishing it, people can use your library without you know, colliding with potentially other libraries that had similar ideas and came up with similar names. Okay, so the last topic of this video is going to be using the React ecosystem itself. So let's say we want to use something like this React number format control from the normal React ecosystem. This is a JavaScript control. It's written in JavaScript. It's published in Npm. And it does this kind of nice input formatty thing for us, where it'll, you know, throw commas in, a monetary unit, and you know, you can format things like credit cards, whatever you need to do. It's a convenient little control. And so we can go to our package JSON. So this is how you would do it in the regular JS ecosystem. And IntelliJ has some nice support here, where if we start sort of typing out what we want, it adds in the comma here. You know, it adds the comment in here, and then it you know, kind of found the version number for me. I just like hit you know, basically command complete here, and it said 4.2 is the latest. Fine. Then I'll pop down here. I'm going to do an npm install. That'll put it in my node modules, and now Shadow's ready to work with it. So I don't have to restart Shadow CLJS or anything. It's going to be all ready to go. So then to interop with something like this, I just need to go and read its page. So it says, all right, I've got to, if I go to pull it in, I pull it in with one of these mechanisms. ES5, ES6. And if you look at the Shadow CLJS documentation, you can translate this to basically React number format, sort of like you would in the require there. And that should get me my number format class. Now that's a class. And it is yellow here. IntelliJ /cursive doesn't yet understand this Shadow CLJS convention, nor can I think it can't really just go and look in the JavaScript to figure it out. So it just tells you, oh, sorry. So that's an unfortunate thing that I don't personally know a fix. If you do, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know how to get around that. So now the issue is we need to call essentially React's create element on this, because that's what JSX does. So if we're writing, we go and we look at a JSX example like this. JSX converts this. If you go and look at the React documentation, and I'm going to write sort of JavaScripty here, it would be like react.create element, and then the class, number format, etc. So that's what we need to do here. And so I've created some React Interop helper functions that'll do that for you, so you don't have to, oops, wrong one. You don't have to manually do this every time. This Interop namespace currently has, at the time of this recording, a helper function for making these factories so that you can use them like your DOM elements in regular Fulcro. And it also includes a higher order component helper. The developer's guide talks about using both of these in detail. So I'm going to say UI number format is an interop React factory on number format. And this React factor, if you go and look at the code, it basically just calls create element for you, passes the class, it converts ClojureScript props to JavaScript, because remember this is a JavaScript thing, so it's expecting to see JavaScript stuff, and then passes in any children. It's really quite simple to do. It's just kind of handy to have the thing laying around. So now if I go and look at one of these examples, I should be able to just pop in here and say, oh, well, let's make a field for a monetary amount, which is going to be a UI number format with some parameters. And let's see, now they say thousands separator. True. And prefix of a $. And you do have to do a little bit of JavaScripty conversion here. So in JSX, curly braces mean throw some code in there. So we don't need to do that because we're in code. And then single quotes in JavaScript create strings, as do double quotes, whereas in ClojureScript it's always going to be quotes. So there's a little bit of stuff you've got to do there. But now we see an amount, and we can start typing in our number. It got the prefix, but it did not get the thousand separator because I probably misspelled. Yeah, I sure did. Thousand separator. So you get down, I'm using this React control. It is a component that works a lot like normal DOM inputs. This is a side note that I should put everywhere. Please remember that DOM inputs in HTML always take strings as inputs and always give you strings back as output. Even things like time inputs and date inputs, they're always dealing in strings. And if you need those to be in a numeric type of your own, then you typically want to wrap them in some sort of logic to do that. I may cover that in a later video, but for the time being, this is what I wanted to cover. So that's the basic, using a React library. You saw how easy that was to pull that in via Shadow CLJS. Really no headache at all.